The morning they ran us through the intake yard at V-Thrani Combined Arms, I counted 11 species standing in formation, and I was the only one who didn't know what the Keth-class combat drone was. That's not entirely true. I'd read the orientation packet on the transit barge from Durath 9, same as everyone else. I knew it was the Academy's primary first-year assessment platform. I knew it had been in continuous operation for 23 standard years. I knew it had a recorded interaction history of over 4,000 cadet trials, and that the Academy published its aggregate data openly, the way institutions publish records they're proud of. What I hadn't understood, reading that packet in my bunk while the barge churned through null space, was what the numbers actually meant. The Keth class had a first-year completion rate of 0. Not low, not poor, 0. In 23 years of operation, no first-year cadet had ever completed a full-sequence trial against the machine. The Academy didn't hide this. They printed it in the intake documentation with a tone that suggested they considered it a feature. I read it the same way I'd read a lot of things in that packet, absorbing it, filing it, not attaching much weight to it. On Durath 9, most things that were supposed to be impossible turned out to be impossible in ways that had specific, workable edges. You learned to look for the edge. You learned that very young, or you didn't learn anything at all after a certain point, because the planet had a way of settling the question permanently. I didn't find out how seriously the rest of the Academy took that 0 until the morning of the trial. Durath 9 is not a world that produces cautious people. That's not a boast, it's geography. The planet sits in the outer arc of the V-Thrani colonial zone, a fact that in the Academy's administrative records means it shows up in the threat index column as 6.1, which is a number, which means something specific to someone who knows the scale. What it means on the ground is this: the fauna is large, territorial, and in several cases actively predatory toward anything in the 50 to 200 kilogram range, which includes humans. The colonial settlement on Durath 9 has been there for 4 generations. The settlement survived 4 generations by developing a specific relationship with the terrain, one that involves paying attention and not making assumptions about what the next hour holds. The Youth Ranger program was established in the 2nd generation, after a run of incidents in the eastern districts made it clear that the adult patrol network had gaps the geography kept finding. The program took kids at 13 and gave them structured patrol work, perimeter monitoring, track and log on fauna movement, basic deterrent deployment, and it gave them it seriously, which is to say with real equipment and real consequences, and an understanding that the terrain didn't adjust its behavior to accommodate the fact that they were young. I joined at 13. I was certified for Category 3 and below fauna by 14. I was working Category 4 encounter protocols by 15, alongside adult patrols, because Supervisor Orvith had looked at my first-year records and made a judgment call that the program's age gadding was a guideline and not a rule. She was the kind of person who made those distinctions carefully and correctly. I haven't met many like her, but the ones I've met all have the same quality. They see what's actually in front of them rather than what the documentation says should be in front of them. She saw a 15-year-old with good instincts and correct training responses and a threat index 6-1 planet outside the perimeter wall, and she did the arithmetic the right way. The drill yard at V-Thrani sat at the eastern edge of the main compound, a long rectangle of hardpack pale as bone, ringed by a low barrier wall and overlooked from the north by a second-level observation platform. The platform was for instructors and senior cadets. On trial mornings, it filled up. I found that out later. That first morning, I didn't look up at it until the Keth class was already active, and by then I had other things to look at. Our intake cohort was 47 cadets, drawn from 19 systems. The V-Thrani orientation staff had divided us into trial groups of 4 or 5. My group was the 3rd of the morning. We waited near the barrier wall while groups 1 and 2 went through ahead of us. I watched both runs carefully. The Keth-class combat drone was not what I'd pictured. I'd read automated training platform and pictured something stationary, a target array, maybe a pressure response simulator. What rolled out onto the hardpack was a machine the size of a large agricultural lifter, roughly ovoid, with 4 articulated limbs that served as both locomotion and strike appendages. Its surface was matte black with a faint subsurface luminescence that pulsed in slow intervals, the way deepwater creatures pulse, not to attract but to warn. It moved with a precision that felt deliberate in a way that pure mechanics shouldn't feel deliberate. Not alive, exactly, but considered. Every motion calculated 3 iterations ahead. The trial protocol was simple. A cadet entered the yard alone. The Keth class activated. The cadet was required to remain mobile within the boundary for 1 standard rotation of the assessment clock, 12 minutes. Physical contact with the machine's strike limbs constituted an automatic termination. Leaving the boundary constituted a forfeit. Completing the rotation without either constituted a pass. The first group sent in a Korathi cadet named Brevok, who was 2 years older than me and had come to Thrani with a full merit scholarship and a regional combat record that had circulated through the cohort's social channels before we'd even docked. He lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The Keth class put him down without apparent effort, 1 strike limb moving in a short arc that caught him across the upper chest and dropped him flat. He was upright again in under a minute. The machine was calibrated not to injure, only to stop, but the trial clock had already frozen. The second cadet in that group lasted 2 minutes and 50 seconds. The third lasted 6 minutes and change, which drew a sound from the observation platform that I can only describe as impressed murmuring. Then the machine adjusted, shifted its approach pattern, and ended the trial in under 30 seconds flat. Second group went the same way. Longer attempts from 2 cadets who had prior combat training, shorter from the others. The longest run in the second group hit 8 minutes and 4 seconds before the machine made a single lateral lunge that the cadet simply had no answer for. None of this disturbed me. I watched it with genuine interest, noting the machine's patterns, the way it herded rather than chased, the way it used the boundary geometry to reduce the cadet's viable movement space before committing to a strike. It was elegant in its way, efficient design. What disturbed me slightly was the cadet standing to my left while we watched. His name was Drool Vasek, 4th year. Korathi, like Brevok, same wide-shouldered build, same pale gray-green skin, same brow ridge that gave every Korathi face a look of permanent assessment, as though they were perpetually deciding whether a thing was worth their time. Vasek had come to the observation wall on his own, which wasn't unusual. Senior cadets were permitted to observe intake trials. What was unusual was the way he'd positioned himself, not beside the other 4th years who drifted out to watch, but specifically beside my group and specifically beside me. He'd been looking at me since before the first trial started, not the way you look at something interesting, the way you look at something you've already categorized. Dureth 9, he said, when the second group's 3rd cadet sat down on the bench outside the boundary, finished. That's right, I said. Colony World, Threat Index 6.1. He said it the way you'd cite a statistic to establish that you'd done your reading. Frontier designation, pre-infrastructure. Your cohort file says you came up through the Youth Ranger program. It does. That's a ground patrol certification, perimeter work, wilderness survival. He let a pause sit there, waited. Not combat training. Not formally, I agreed. He nodded once, the way someone nods when you've confirmed the thing they already believed. The Keth class reads biological stress markers, he said. Heart rate, cortisol analogs, pressure response. It calibrates its threat output to keep a subject at maximum cognitive load without inducing shutdown. It's designed to push, not to break. He paused again. The problem is that the calibration assumes a baseline, and your baseline, coming off a colony world, is going to read higher than a standard cadet. I looked at him. You think I'll go faster? I think the machine will read you as already stressed and start at a higher threat level than it would for most first years, and I think that will make the trial considerably shorter. He said this without malice, just the flatness of a conclusion reached through logic. I've watched 43 intake trials in 3 years. I know what the Keth class does to cadets who come in hot. He wasn't wrong about the machine's calibration logic. He'd explained it accurately. He just reached the wrong conclusion. I didn't say that. I looked back at the yard, where the staff was resetting the boundary markers for the third group. Thanks for the briefing, I said. He gave me one more look, assessing, final, the look of a man ticking a box, and stepped back. My group's name was called. There were 4 of us. Me, a Vithrani-born cadet named Osk, who was built like a load-bearing column and had been silent since intake registration. A Pelosi female named Chura, who moved with the careful precision of someone who'd trained very hard to compensate for the fact that her species' native environment was low gravity, and this was not. And a young male from one of the Idun systems, whose name I hadn't caught yet, and who had spent the last 40 minutes looking at the Keth class, with an expression I recognized as the particular flavor of dread that comes from knowing something is going to hurt and not being able to stop the clock. The trial order was drawn randomly. A junior staff member called the names from a datapad. Mine was first. I walked through the gap in the barrier wall and into the yard. The hardpack was faintly warm underfoot, passive thermal bleed from the power systems buried under the surface, which ran the boundary sensors and the drones charging pylons. The air smelled of ozone and something sharper underneath, mineral and cold. The boundary wall was low enough that I could see the observation platform clearly from inside the yard, the faces of the senior cadets, and a few instructors arranged along the rail like a frieze. The Keth class sat at the far end of the yard in its inactive configuration, limbs folded close, luminescence dimmed to a slow pulse, waiting. I walked to the center marker and stood there. The activation tone sounded. A single low note that the staff member had told us was a 1-second warning before the machine engaged. I breathed out, slow, deliberate, complete, the way Ranger Supervisor Orvith had taught me in my second year of patrol certification, when we'd spent 3 weeks on the east ridge of Durath's Central Massif doing track and contain work on a Brelith migration. Brelith are large. Their threat index as a species sits at 4.8, which means a standard encounter protocol calls for 3-person teams with heavy deterrent equipment. We'd had 2 people, standard patrol loadout, and the migration had crossed our route 6 times in 10 days. You learn to breathe, or you don't learn anything. The Keth class activated. The change was immediate and total. The slow luminescent pulse accelerated to a sharp strobe. The 4 limbs unfolded with a sound like a pressure release, controlled, not explosive, but fast in a way that communicated capability rather than speed for its own sake. The ovoid body rotated, orienting. Then the machine was still for exactly 1.3 seconds. I found out later that the 1.3-second pause was the bioreading window. The machine sampled heart rate, skin conductance, respiratory pattern, micromuscular tension in the face and hands. From that sample it computed a threat output level and committed to an opening approach pattern. Standard first-year profile, I was told later by a staff technician who became considerably more talkative than she'd intended to be. Elevated cortisol analog, heart rate in the 110 to 130 range, respiratory rate up, hands showing grip tension. For a first year from a standard background system, that reading would push the machine to what the staff called Tier 2, moderately aggressive, quick repositioning, designed to make the cadet work hard to stay mobile without immediately closing for a strike. For a first year from a high-threat colony world, the machine would read even higher and escalate to Tier 3 sustained pressure, coordinated approach angles, forcing the cadet to make decisions faster than they could execute them. Tier 3 was where most of the 4 to 6 minute collapses happened. Vasek had been right about the machine escalating for a colony world baseline. He'd just been wrong about what my baseline was. Heart rate 67, cortisol analog low normal, respiratory rate 12, grip tension none. I found out much later that the machine's bioread of me during that 1.3-second window produced a result its calibration system had never seen in a first-year cadet trial. It had seen those numbers before in third and fourth-year advanced trials from cadets who'd undergone 2 or 3 years of high-stress conditioning. It had never seen them in a first year. The calibration system, faced with a reading it didn't have a model for, did the only logical thing it could. It defaulted to Tier 1. Tier 1 was the introductory setting. It was used for cadets identified as physically impaired, very young, or coming from non-combat backgrounds with no stress conditioning history whatsoever. It was, in the frank terminology of the Academy's internal documentation, designed to provide a non-threatening orientation to the platform's capabilities. The Keth class advanced on me at Tier 1. I want to be precise about what that felt like because I think the precision matters. The machine moved well. It was fast for its size, covered ground smoothly, and its approach geometry was correct, angling to push me toward the eastern boundary rather than coming straight at me, which would have been easier to read. At Tier 1, it wasn't trying to end the trial. It was testing mobility response. I moved. Not dramatically, stepped left, changed my weight distribution, kept the center of the yard open behind me. The machine tracked and adjusted. I watched its limbs, not its body, because the limbs were where the commitment would show first. 12 minutes is not a long time when you are calm, and not a short time when you are not. I had been on 3-day patrol rotations in the Durath Massif with nothing but my pack and a deterrent emitter that had a documented 30% malfunction rate in temperatures below -40. I had tracked Brelith through terrain that didn't have a name yet because the survey teams hadn't finished their charts. I had spent 4 hours in a shallow hide under a rock shelf, while a pack of Rith-Kai worked the slope 20 meters above me, waiting for them to move off before I could continue the route. 12 minutes was a walk to the mess hall. The Keth class ran its Tier 1 protocol for approximately 90 seconds before its ongoing bioread flagged something it hadn't flagged at the start. My numbers hadn't changed. Standard Tier 1 response produced a measurable stress escalation in cadets within the first 30 seconds, heart rate up, cortisol rising, the first signs of the physical load accumulating. The machine was designed to recognize that escalation and begin modulating its pressure upward to keep the cadet at optimal load. I wasn't escalating. The machine recalibrated, moved to Tier 2. Tier 2 was more interesting. The approach geometry got tighter, the limb movements less broadcast, less readable. The machine started using the boundary wall on my left as a constraint, angling to cut my available space. I adjusted my route, kept moving, gave it angles that looked like hesitation and weren't. On Durath, we learned early that the worst thing you could do against a large-bodied predator was let it think it had you reading one step behind. You stayed readable enough to be trackable, unreadable enough to be unpredictable. The Brelith were smart. Rith-Kai were smarter. The Keth class was a machine, which meant it was predictable in ways that living things aren't, but that predictability only helped you if you were calm enough to read it. I was calm. The machine ran Tier 2 for 2 minutes and 20 seconds. My numbers still weren't escalating. Heart rate had come up perhaps 4 beats. Cortisol analog showed a slight increase that was probably indistinguishable from moderate exercise. The machine's ongoing calibration read this and reached the same conclusion it had reached before. The subject was not responding to the current threat level as expected. Escalate. Tier 3. Now the yard got smaller. The Keth class changed character noticeably at Tier 3. Its movements lost the almost leisurely quality of the lower settings and gained something that I can only describe as intent. The spacing between approach and withdrawal narrowed. The angles it used were genuinely constraining, not just suggestive. It started using its secondary limbs to bracket my movement at the same time the primary limbs pushed forward, which meant there was always more to track than felt comfortable. I found it interesting. That's the honest account. I found it interesting the way I found the Rithkai interesting, not exciting, not terrifying, but genuinely worth my attention. There was a logic to the machine's behavior that rewarded reading, and reading it was satisfying in the uncomplicated way that any well-constructed problem is satisfying when you have the tools to work it. The tools I had were a calm nervous system, 4 years of youth ranger patrol work that had included more genuine predator encounters than the machine's designers had probably modeled for, and the particular quality of attention that you develop when you spend enough time in terrain that doesn't forgive mistakes. Not aggression, not bravery, just attention, free of noise. I moved through Tier 3 the way I'd moved through the other tiers. Steadily, without drama, keeping the open space behind me, watching the limbs adjusting. The observation platform had gone quiet. I noticed this at around the 6-minute mark, the way you notice a sound stopping not because it's jarring but because its absence makes the air feel different. I didn't look up. There wasn't a reason to look up. At 7 minutes, the machine escalated again. I found out later this was called Tier 3 Enhanced. It wasn't a standard tier designation in the training documentation, but the staff technicians used the term informally to describe what the machine did when it reached maximum standard pressure, and a cadet's bioreadings still weren't producing the expected stress response. Tier 3 Enhanced meant the machine stopped managing its energy output conservatively and committed to a genuine close-distance engagement sequence. I had 4.5 minutes left on the clock. The machine came in fast, really fast, faster than it had moved at any point in the preceding 7 minutes, the kind of speed that, if you haven't already established a read on the thing's movement patterns, would have you reacting half a second too late. The primary limbs were set for a lateral sweep, and the body was angled to push me into the eastern boundary corner, where the secondary limbs would have a natural containment geometry. I was already moving before the commitment showed in the limbs. Left, 2 steps, putting the corner behind the machine rather than behind me, which meant its prepared geometry was suddenly wrong and it needed a beat to reorganize. That beat was enough. I was back in the open center, the machine was turning, and we were back to tracking. I heard something from the observation platform, not the murmuring I'd noticed before, something sharper, briefer, cut off. I still didn't look up. The next 4.5 minutes went the way the first 7.5 had gone, except that the machine was now committing at a level I hadn't seen it reach with the earlier groups. It tried 7 separate engagement sequences in that final stretch. Every one of them had a geometry that would have caught a cadet who was running on adrenaline and degraded decision-making, reacting to each movement rather than reading ahead of it. I read ahead. I want to be clear that this was not a performance. I was not trying to impress anyone, and I was not particularly aware of being watched in any way that registered as pressure. I was doing the only thing I knew how to do in that kind of situation, which was exactly what I'd have done alone on the East Ridge at -40 with the deterrent emitter tucked under my arm and the pack weight shifting my balance on the downslope. Pay attention. Move correctly. Don't borrow trouble from the next 2 seconds. The assessment clock completed its rotation. The single low tone sounded, the same note as the activation, mirrored. The Keth class stopped. Its limbs folded back into the resting configuration, the strobe pulse slowing to its inactive interval, and the machine stood there in the center of the yard with the self-contained stillness of something that had run its sequence and was waiting for the next instruction. I walked to the boundary gap and stepped out of the yard. The staff member with the datapad was looking at me with an expression I didn't have an immediate category for. She was a Pelosi, Like Chura, same narrow face, same pale coloring, but older senior staff insignia on her collar. She looked at her datapad, looked at me, looked at the datapad again. "Cadet," she said, "confirm your cohort registration number." I confirmed it. She noted something on the pad. "Stand by," she said, and walked quickly toward the equipment station at the north end of the boundary wall, where another staff member was already looking at a display and talking in a low voice into a communication unit. I stood by. To my right, the three other cadets in my group were looking at me. Osk, the silent column, had an expression I was beginning to learn was his version of surprise, a very slight widening of the eyes, almost nothing but there. Chura's look was more direct, openly assessing, recalibrating. The Idun cadet was just starring. To my left, further along the wall, Drul Vasek was standing exactly where he'd been standing before. He wasn't looking at the yard anymore. He was looking at me. I looked back at him. He held it for 2 seconds, then looked away, toward the equipment station, where the staff member was still on the communication unit. He didn't say anything. The staff member came back. She had a second datapad now, cross-referencing something between the two. "Cadet," she said, "the assessment system is logging an anomalous biored sequence for your trial. The Keth class calibration log shows 4-tier escalations over the course of the trial, which is outside the standard range for a first-year interaction." She said this precisely, without editorial color. "The technical staff would like to do a post-trial bioverification before logging your result. Standard procedure for an anomalous read. It won't affect your pass status." "All right," I said. "The trial is logged as a pass," she added, and then she seemed to feel the need to say something else and settled on. "That's the first-year completion in the current academic cycle." I nodded. "In 23 years of Keth class operation," she continued, still in that precise, informational tone, "this is the 9th first-year completion on record." She said it like she was reading from documentation, which she was. "Thank you," I said. She nodded, made another note on the pad, and went to call the next trial name. I walked back toward the waiting bench. My group's other 3 cadets were still watching me. I sat down and Osk, who hadn't said a word since intake registration, said in a very low voice, "How?" It wasn't a question, quite. It was the shape a question makes when someone already knows they might not have the context to process the answer. "Dureth 9, I said. He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when a thing is explained, but the explanation contains its own mystery. Chura said more directly, "Your heart rate during the Tier 3 enhanced sequence, the system was reading you at 69 beats per standard minute. That's resting rate." "Yes," I said. "That's not possible." "It's apparently the baseline for extended predator encounter work," I said. "Your system calibrates down. You stop running hot because running hot is expensive and the encounters last a long time." She was quiet for a moment. "How long were the encounters?" "The ones that mattered, 3 to 4 days usually, sometimes longer." Another silence. "Against what?" the Idun cadet said. His voice was very careful, like he was asking a question he wasn't sure he wanted the full answer to. "Brelith mostly, Rithgai on the high ground, occasional mixed territory." He looked at me for a long moment, and then looked back at the yard, where his own trial was being called. He lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The machine caught him in a lateral push against the north boundary wall. He sat on the bench afterward with the expression of someone who had just had an unpleasant theory about the universe confirmed. I didn't say anything to him about it. There was nothing useful to say. The bioverification took 40 minutes and involved a Pelosi staff medic with a portable sensor array who seemed personally affronted by my readings, but was too professional to say so. She confirmed everything the Keth class had recorded: resting range heart rate, low cortisol analog, respiratory pattern consistent with moderate rest, grip tension undetectable. She ran the panel twice and then said, "This is consistent with long-term deathworld conditioning," in the same tone that a detective uses when they've found the answer to a puzzle and are disappointed by how simple it is. "That's what I told the other staff member," I said. She looked at me in a way that suggested she was reconsidering the categories she'd started the appointment with. Then she pulled up a secondary display and started reading. "Your Ranger certification file notes 37 confirmed predator encounters over a 4-year patrol period." She paused on the number the way people pause when a number is larger than the container they'd prepared for it. "That's a considerable number for a youth ranger program." "Durath 9 has a considerable number of predators," I said. She looked at me over the display. "How many of those encounters involved Category 4 or above fauna?" 19 confirmed. Probably 4 or 5 more that we didn't get clean documentation on because the terrain didn't allow for standard logging protocol. She looked at the display again. "The Brelith are listed as Category 4.8. "Yes." "And you encountered them 19 confirmed times." "In groups, usually. The migration routes cross the patrol perimeter 6 to 8 times a season. You can't avoid them, and you can't reroute the perimeter, so you learn to work with the terrain and the timing." She made several notes, then said, "The Keth class calibration was designed based on aggregate biodata from cadets coming from systems with threat indices up to 4.2. The documentation notes that the calibration was not validated against deathworld populations." "That sounds like a gap in the documentation," I said. She looked at me again. The look was not unfriendly. It was the look of someone recontextualizing something. "It does," she said. "Yes." The verification report went into the system, and my trial result was formally logged. A pass. First-year completion. I didn't see the documentation until later in the week, when a copy was routed to my cohort file, and by then other things had happened that made the documentation feel like a footnote to a longer story. That afternoon, the 4th trial group went through, then the 5th, then the 6th. The Academy ran intake trials for 3 consecutive days for each cohort. My trial was on day 1, morning session. By the end of day 3, 44 of the 47 cadets in the cohort had gone through the Keth class. 3 had been flagged for medical holds and would run separately. The cumulative result across the 44 trials was 4 additional passes. Osk, who turned out to have come from a moderately high-threat colony world himself, and whose silence, I was now realizing, was a personality trait rather than nervousness. A Korathi 4th cohort transfer named Belak, who had prior combat service, and whose stress profile was apparently well-conditioned. And 2 cadets from the 2nd day whose specific backgrounds I didn't know, but who, I heard from the common room conversations that evening, had each completed the trial in the 10 to 11-minute range with visible difficulty, which was the standard profile for an experienced stress-conditioned cadet. None of them had completed it at Tier 3 Enhanced. That was the qualifier that kept coming up in the common room conversations and the mess hall discussions, the detail that traveled through the cohort the way specific details do when a cohort is trying to sort itself out and establish its internal geography. The Keth class had never reached Tier 3 Enhanced with a first-year cadet before, not in 23 years, not once. The machine reached that protocol when the standard pressure tiers failed to produce the expected stress response, and until my trial on day 1, morning session, no first-year cadet had been physiologically constituted in a way that made the standard tiers insufficient. I heard my own trial described in the common room on the evening of day 2 by cadets who hadn't been at the yard for it, who'd heard it from cadets who had. The description was mostly accurate. The 4-tier escalations were accurate. The 12-minute completion was accurate. The detail that the machine had made 7 separate engagement attempts in the final 4.5 minutes was accurate, though the cadet reporting it said 9, which I could have corrected but didn't. What wasn't accurate was the characterization of what it had looked like. The cadet doing the describing, a Vithrani native named Saul, who was good with mechanics and had a gift for storytelling that outpaced his gift for precision, described my movement during the trial as fighting the drone, which made it sound like something it wasn't. I hadn't fought the machine. Fighting implies a sustained offensive exchange, something back and forth and deliberate, a contest of force and counterforce. I had moved around the yard for 12 minutes without letting the machine touch me, which is a different thing. The difference matters because the skill is different. Fighting requires specific combat training that I didn't have. Moving correctly under pressure requires a different kind of training that I did have, and it requires a different kind of patience. Not the patience of waiting for your moment, but the patience of not needing a moment, of being content to simply stay present and mobile and correctly placed until time handles the rest. Saul's version was more dramatic. Naturally, it was the version that traveled. By the evening of day 2, the cohort had largely sorted itself into 2 camps. The cadets who had gone through the trial and wanted to talk about it, and the cadets who hadn't yet and didn't want to think about it. I occupied an uncomfortable middle position in this sorting, because I had gone through it, and my outcome was the one being discussed, and I had nothing useful to add to the discussion that Saul's version hadn't already absorbed. Anything I said to correct it would either come across as modesty or as something worse than modesty. So I said nothing and ate my mess hall ration and let the story be the story. But I noticed things. I noticed which cadets were listening carefully and which were listening performatively. I noticed who was watching me across the common room and recalibrating, and who was watching me and performing nonchalance, which is a different kind of recalibration. I noticed Belak, the Korathi transfer with prior combat service, who had himself completed the trial that day, and who was sitting in the far corner of the room with a cup of something, and the particular stillness of someone who has done enough real things to find the storytelling about real things mildly tiresome. We made eye contact once. He raised his cup slightly, just enough to acknowledge the shared experience of being in a room where your own mourning was being dramatized by someone who wasn't there. I understood the gesture. But the descriptions and the noise of the room weren't what held my attention. What held it was Drool Vasek's absence. This was notable because he'd been a visible presence in the shared spaces since intake day. The 4th years maintained a kind of ambient authority over the communal areas, less by assertion than by simple occupancy, and the weight of 3 years of institutional standing. His absence meant something had changed in his relationship to what the common room was representing, which was a version of the cohort's first week that included a detail he'd predicted wrong. He had predicted I'd go fast. I had not gone fast. I ran into him on the morning of day 3, in the corridor between the equipment stores and the secondary drill hall. He was coming one direction, I was going the other, and the corridor was narrow enough that we both stopped. He looked at me for a moment. The permanent assessment expression of Korathi faces makes it difficult to read what's happening beneath it. The brow ridge and the slightly forward jaw are set that way regardless of what the person is feeling, and you have to learn to read the smaller signals. The set of the shoulders, the angle of the chin, the duration and quality of eye contact. He looked at me and then said, "The bioverification." "Yes," I said. 37 predator encounters, he said, Category 4 and above. 19 confirmed. He nodded once. It was a different nod than the one from the first morning, not the nod of a man ticking a box, but the nod of someone incorporating a piece of information that has changed the shape of something larger. "I'd read your file before the trial," he said. "I read the Ranger certification listing. I didn't understand what it meant." This was not an apology. It wasn't self-deprecating. It was a correction of a record stated plainly. "Most people don't," I said. "The indexing doesn't convey the practical difference between Category 3 fauna and Category 4, or what it does to your baseline over time. He was quiet for a moment. My family's from Chorath Prime, Threat Index 1.4. The most dangerous fauna native to my region is a species of pack scavenger that targets disabled livestock. He said this without embarrassment, but without pretense either. I've had 3 years of the Academy's stress conditioning program. My stress profile is, I've been told it's among the best in the 4th year. I believe it, I said. If I'd come up through your Ranger program, he said, would my numbers look like yours? I thought about this genuinely, because it was a genuine question. Probably not after 4 years, I said. The conditioning effect accumulates over time and it's specific to the kind of threat you're exposed to. The Brelith and the Wraith-Kai are the encounters last a long time, and the consequences of error are absolute. That builds a specific kind of response. I don't know if it transfers from a different stimulus type. I paused. The Academy's stress program is designed to work for most species coming from most backgrounds. It's good work. It just wasn't designed with Durath 9 as the upper reference point. He was quiet again. The quality of his silence had changed from the first day's silence, which had been the silence of a settled judgment. This was the silence of someone revising. There are 4 other cadets in this cohort from Threat Index 5 or above, he said. 2 from 5+, 2 from 6+. Your threat index is the highest. I know, I said. The Academy's stress conditioning program runs for 2 years as part of the standard curriculum. For the cadets coming from high-threat backgrounds, the program documentation says the curriculum is adjusted to focus on sustained engagement endurance rather than baseline establishment. He looked at me steadily. That seems like it might miss the point. It might, I said. Another pause. He was still looking at me, and the assessment quality in that look had become something else, not warmer exactly, but less settled, more open. I'm the senior cadet assigned to your cohort's first-year mentorship track, he said. I have 12 hours of scheduled contact time with your group over the first month. I was planning to use 6 of those hours on stress conditioning fundamentals. That seems less relevant now, I said. Yes, he said. He held the eye contact another moment. I'll revise the schedule. He moved past me in the corridor and was gone. I stood there a moment, then continued toward the drill hall. The revised schedule, I found out over the following weeks, replaced the stress conditioning hours with extended predator encounter theory seminars. Vasek ran them himself. He pulled the encounter data from the Durath 9 patrol logs. The Academy had access to the Colonial Ranger Service's documentation for curriculum research purposes, and built a 6-session series around behavioral analysis of Category 4 and above fauna. Approach patterns, territorial logic, the specific ways large-bodied threats exploit terrain and geometry. I attended these sessions. So did Osk and Belak, and gradually a wider fraction of the cohort who found that the material was useful not because they'd faced Brelith, but because the underlying principles of reading movement geometry and managing long-duration threat exposure translated to nearly every scenario the Academy's curriculum put them through. Vasek was a good instructor. He was precise with technical material, direct with feedback, and he had the quality that distinguishes a capable instructor from a merely knowledgeable one. He knew where the edges of his own understanding were, and he said so. In the 3rd session, when I expanded on a point he'd made about Wraith-Kai territorial aggression with specifics from my own patrol experience, he listened without interrupting, incorporated it into the session without crediting it as his own, and afterward asked me 2 follow-up questions that were genuinely aimed at understanding rather than at appearing to understand. He also ran a session in the 4th week that I didn't expect. He pulled population-level data on the distribution of high-threat origin cadets across the Academy's intake history, 30 years of records, and walked through the patterns in that data. High-threat cadets had historically shown better-than-average performance in the advanced tactical curriculum, and significantly better than average performance on sustained engagement assessments. They had also historically showed higher than average early dropout rates in the first 2 months, concentrated in the period before the stress conditioning curriculum fully activated. Vasek's read on this was that the system was losing its best potential long-duration performers in the early phase because the early phase had been calibrated without them in mind. He said this to the room without editorializing. He put the data up and let it say what it said. But at the end of the session, he held me back for 2 minutes and said, "You're the reason I went looking for that data. I thought you should know that." I worked with him for the rest of the first month, and then for the rest of the first year, and by the end of it, the first morning version of Drool Vasek, the one who had stood at the barrier wall to watch a Colony World cadet go down quickly, was a figure I had almost no use for. The man who had revised the mentorship schedule and built a curriculum out of his own corrected assumption was a more interesting person to know. The Keth class records were published in the Academy's internal directory at the end of the first-year assessment cycle. The listing for my trial took up half a page, which was unusual. Most trial records were a single line. The additional space was occupied by the technical note that the bioread anomaly had prompted a formal review of the machine's calibration protocols, and a recommendation to update the baseline dataset to include deathworld populations at threat indices above 5.5. The review board's recommendation was also noted. It read, in part, "The current calibration model assumes a standard upper bound for first-year stress conditioning that the incident data suggests is not applicable across all origin populations. The Keth class is designed to push cadets to productive limits. In the documented case, no productive limit was identified within the machine's operational range." That was the formal language. What it meant was that the machine had reached the top of what it could do and found nothing there, because the thing it was designed to push against wasn't present in a form it had a model for. I didn't feel particularly remarkable about this. You don't feel remarkable about having a nervous system that adapted to the place you grew up in. You feel remarkable about the place, maybe, if you have enough distance from it to see it clearly. Durath 9 in my mind was mostly weather and terrain, and the particular quality of the light through the massif canopy in early morning, when the thermal inversion over the eastern valleys made the air look solid. It was patrol rotations with Supervisor Orvith and the way she talked through decisions in the field, not explaining them, just thinking out loud in a way that made the reasoning visible. It was the Brelith track in the second summer, the one that had gone badly in the first 12 hours and then resolved cleanly over the following 60, and the thing Orvith had said afterward, "You don't get better at hard things by not doing them." I thought about that sometimes in the Academy's training yard, usually while the assessment clock was still running and the Keth class was running through whatever protocol it had escalated to. You don't get better at hard things by not doing them. The machine had 4 tier settings and 1 beyond range protocol. I had 37 encounters and counting, spread across 4 years of ground that didn't have margins. The comparison wasn't interesting in its outcome. Of course, the machine ran out of room before I did, but it was interesting in what it said about how you build a person. You don't build them in a lab with calibrated stress doses and documented tier escalations. You build them in the field in the actual thing, and you build them slow, one encounter at a time, until the difference between what's dangerous and what's dangerous enough to change the way your body responds is so large that a machine with 23 years of data has to invent a new category to describe it. The staff technician who had run my bioverification had a notation in my record at the end of the first year. I saw it when I reviewed my curriculum progress file. It read, "Recommend longitudinal study of deathworld conditioned cadets in Keth class assessment contexts. Baseline data insufficient." I appreciated the precision of that last line. Baseline data insufficient. It was the most honest summary of the situation I'd seen in any official document. The year after mine, The Academy's intake protocol included a new pre-trial classification. Origin World Threat Index above 5.5 received a flag in the system that prompted the Keth class to skip the standard biored calibration and begin directly at Tier 2. This was the program's attempt to solve the problem the calibration gap had created, not by fixing the calibration, but by adjusting the starting point. I heard about this secondhand. By then I was in second year, and the first-year intake trial wasn't something I was formally involved with, though I went to the yard on the first day of the new cycle the way senior cadets sometimes did, out of institutional habit more than anything else. There was one cadet from Erath 7 that year, threat index 6.3, older than most first years, mid-20s, with the kind of quiet that you recognize if you've spent time around people who have had to be quiet because noise gets you hurt. She had come up through a different program than I had, not ranger work, but deep retrieval contract labor, which on a high-threat world means something considerably less tidy than it sounds. The Keth class started her at Tier 2. She completed the trial in 12 minutes. The machine reached Tier 3, enhanced at around the 8-minute mark. She walked out of the boundary gap, and the staff member with the datapad gave her the same look the Pelosi senior staff member had given me the year before. I was standing near the observation wall. She looked around the yard, taking in the layout, and then she looked at the machine, which had gone back to its inactive configuration, and then she looked at the staff member. "Is there a harder setting?" she said. The question was asked without irony, without performance. She genuinely wanted to know if the machine had more to offer, because she had 12 minutes left in her morning and she wasn't sure what else to do with them. I didn't say anything. I stepped back from the observation wall and let the staff member field it. Later, when we walked back toward the main compound in the same direction, I fell into step beside her without planning to. "Erath 7, I said. "Durath 9, she said, which meant she'd read the same notification in the trial prep materials that I had. We walked in silence for a while. "The staff will tell you the record," she said eventually. "They told me before the trial." 9 first-year completions, I said, now 10. "They also told me the machine escalated 4 times in the previous record-holding trial." She glanced at me sideways. "Mine was 5. I looked at her. "The starting tier is different now," she said. "If you start at Tier 2, you can get to Tier 3 enhanced faster. And then if you're still there at the 12-minute mark, apparently there's a Tier 4. "I didn't know there was a Tier 4, I said. "There is," she said. "The technician mentioned it when she ran my verification. She said it's never been triggered in a standard trial. It requires the system to register a complete failure of all 4 standard escalation protocols before it unlocks." She paused. "Apparently it did register that, but I ran out of clock." I thought about this for a moment. "Well," I said. "Yes," she said. We walked the rest of the way in silence. It was a good silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled, between 2 people who have discovered they have the same relationship to quiet. At the compound entrance, she said, without particular weight, "I'm going to ask the curriculum office about an extended sequence trial option, something longer than 12 minutes. "They'll probably tell you it's not in the documentation," I said. "Probably," she agreed, "but it wasn't in the documentation that anyone could reach Tier 4 either." She went through the compound entrance. I stood there a moment, watching her go, thinking about documentation and baselines, and the specific shape of the gap between what a system knows and what a system needs to know. Then I went in. There was a meeting with the curriculum office that afternoon. I know because I received a notification to attend it, which meant I hadn't been the only person watching the yard that morning and drawing conclusions. The meeting was attended by 4 staff members, 2 senior cadets, the head of the assessment programs division, and in a transmission window from the administrative hub, someone from the Academy's curriculum review board whose name I didn't catch. They wanted to talk about the calibration documentation. The baseline data was insufficient. They'd known this since my trial the year before, but the committee process for updating formal documentation moves slowly, the way institution processes do, and the update recommendation had been in the review queue since the post-trial notation. 2 trials that hit Tier 4 protocols, one nominal, one triggered, in consecutive years was going to move the update higher in the queue. I sat in the meeting and answered the questions I was asked, and offered information I wasn't asked for when it seemed useful, which it sometimes was. The head of the assessment programs division was a Vithrani named Korathvel, who had been running the program for 11 years, and who had the quality of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that the most interesting problems were the ones the documentation hadn't anticipated. She asked at the end of the meeting, when the Academy revises the calibration protocols to account for high-threat origin populations, and it will, we're going to fast-track the update now, what's the right ceiling? I thought about Durath 9, the 37 encounters, the Rithkai on the high ground, and the way 4 days felt different from 12 minutes in every meaningful way except the requirement to stay present. I don't know if there is one, I said. She looked at me. The conditioning doesn't stop accumulating, I said. Every encounter adds to the baseline. The gap between a 20-encounter cadet and a 40-encounter cadet is probably as large as the gap between a 0-encounter cadet and a 20-encounter one. If you're building a calibration ceiling, you're building a ceiling that some cadet from some world is going to outgrow, probably in the first year. Korathvel was quiet for a moment. Then what do you recommend? She said. Build a floor, I said, not a ceiling. Establish where each cadet is at intake and calibrate from that specific baseline, not from a population average. The machine already does a bioread. It's the model the bioread maps to that needs to change. She looked at the curriculum review board representative in the transmission window, who looked back at her. That's a significant revision to the calibration architecture, she said. Yes, I said. It would require rebaselining every Keth-class platform in the Academy system. Yes, I said. She was quiet again, the particular quiet of someone doing institutional arithmetic, what the revision costs against what the current gap costs. The current gap, I said, means the assessment platform is producing meaningless data for every cadet above a certain origin world threat index. You're not measuring their baseline. You're measuring the floor of your own model. That was the line that moved the arithmetic. I could see it. She said, I'll take this to the board as a formal recommendation. The revision took 14 months. I was in 3rd year when the updated calibration architecture went live. And I know because the first week it was running, a 3rd-year cadet from Vora's 12, Threat Index 7.1, the highest origin world rating in the active cohort, ran a personal baseline trial against the updated Keth class, and the machine produced a genuine challenge for him for the first time since intake. He came out of the yard at the 10-minute mark looking like he'd done real work, and there was a quality in his face that I recognized. The specific satisfaction of being met accurately. The documentation for the calibration revision was published in the Academy's internal directory. The summary paragraph included, in its formal language, a note that the previous architecture had identified a systematic gap in the assessment model, and that the revision had been initiated following evidence gathered over 2 consecutive intake cycles from cadets of deathworld origin. It didn't name anyone. Formal documentation doesn't name individuals in systemic summaries. But there were 11 names in the technical appendix, the 9 previous first-year completions, and the 2 from the consecutive cycles, listed as the incident data source for the review. Mine was first. I read it on a Tuesday in the 2nd floor library, with a cup of mess hall kava going cold on the table beside me. I read through the technical appendix carefully, not because I needed to, but because I'd been part of the data and I felt I owed the data my attention. When I finished, I sat for a while thinking about Supervisor Orvith and the East Ridge, and the way the light came through the massif canopy in early morning when the thermal inversion made the air look solid. Thinking about the distance between that and this, between a patrol rotation with a malfunctioning deterrent emitter and a Tuesday in a library with formal documentation. Not a large distance, as it turned out. The same people moved through both. The same skills applied. The thing that worked on the East Ridge worked in the yard, and the thing that worked in the yard worked in the curriculum office meeting, and the curriculum office meeting produced a document that changed how the academy assessed every high-threat cadet who came after. You don't get better at hard things by not doing them. You don't get better at them by doing easier versions of them either. You get better by doing the actual thing, in the actual terrain, with actual consequences for reading it wrong. Every institution that trains people for hard things has to decide, eventually, whether it's going to build its curriculum around the hardest people it will ever train or around the average, and then it has to live with what that decision costs. The academy chose to rebuild. That was the harder decision and the more expensive one and the right one. I drank the cold kava and went to my afternoon session.